Hello and welcome to the Palladium podcast. This is episode number 7. I'm your host, editor-in-chief, Jonah Bennett. And as usual, I'm joined by...
Ash Milton, managing editor.
I'm Wolf Tivy, another editor. We need better titles, guys.
Yeah,
Come on.
okay. Now, moving on, our question of the week this week from the reader mailbag that everyone so generously fills overabundantly every week. Should sugar be classified as a Schedule 3 substance?
Controlled substance. I'll give my answer, which is absolutely yes. Sugar is not good. Sugar is a mind-altering substance. Mind-altering substances are haram. Sugar is just bad for you. It causes diabetes. It's definitely unnatural and weird. I don't like it.
Yeah. What do we think about? So there's the the health effects that we're all too well aware of, but I think sugar has been more historically destructive in the context of empires and slave trade, and should be slotted in with all such foreign substances like coffee and tea and spices.
They're all the things that drove past imperialist expansion and slavery.
Correct.
This is definitely the most
stuff.
Palladium-esque answer.
This is a hot take, okay?
Yes.
That's a hot take.
So I have a very subtle approach to this, which is that we must, of course, classify as Schedule 3 the abomination known as corn syrup, which continues to degrade the North American populace. However, sugarcane is very woke and is a great fuel source, and we cannot allow a sugarcane gap to grow between us and Brazil, which is currently the world leader. So, corn syrup, Schedule 3, sugarcane, no. It's halal.
All right.
No.
Well,
I think sugar cane is absolutely unacceptable. I think all sugar is the same. It's just a chemical. It's all the
This
same
man
stuff.
has been paid off by Bolsonaro. I want to call it here.
All right. That's enough of that. Ash, why don't you before we get into discussing the Balkans article we recently published, what's hot in the news right now is the Venezuela coup, and it is a coup. But before we get into the semantics of that, Ash, why don't you just let everyone know what's been happening, what the situation is over the past few days in Venezuela?
Sure. So it's been a chaotic couple of days, and I'm sure we'll continue to have information coming out over the next week or two. But briefly, the events that transpired were more or less as follows. On April 30th, Guaido, the leader of the opposition, essentially called for mass protests. Another opposition leader named Leopoldo Lopez, who had also been a prominent activist. I believe he had some kind of role as Guaido's mentor. I guess Guaido had taken inspiration from him in the past for the position he has now. He'd been under house arrest and was released, and he appeared with Guaido on April 30th. And the goal, rather, of the protest seems to have been to try and force the military, or at least segments of the military, to cede to the opposition and assist them in taking power. Right now, the military is still one of the main bulwarks of the Maduro government's ability to keep power. And that goes back to the days of Chavez, who, of course, had been a military man as well. So those ties go back some years. They're not particular to Maduro himself. So Guaido had titled this new attempt at protests Operation Freedom. And the goal was, as I say, to ultimately try and get the military to assist them in taking power. What actually ended up happening was in the morning, opposition protests did begin. Several soldiers had appeared with Guaido. I've heard varying numbers on the amount of soldiers that he was able to bring out, like some numbers as low as 15 or 20. I don't believe anyone from sort of a significant rank has really been associated with these or any of the other protests. Nevertheless, a few thousand people did come onto the streets, and the Maduro government rolled out the security forces. Now, this is interesting to me because something that's been ongoing in the Western media is this battle over how to portray the support that the opposition has. I mean, there's clearly is a significant part of Venezuelan society that is anti-Maduro. The opposition support doesn't come out of nowhere, but something that I find is significant here, and that not that many people have commented on, is the fact that Maduro essentially didn't feel the need to make any public statement about this until the evening. These protests started essentially early in the morning, probably around dawn or so, maybe even a bit earlier. And the confidence of Maduro and his government, figures were coming out on social media and on government media denouncing and calling for counter demonstrations, but the security forces more or less seemed to, there was conflict on the streets, but the security forces didn't seem to be particularly worried about a government falling over these protests. They did defend the Miraflores Palace by barricading it. But ultimately, Guaido called for renewed protests on May 1st, which occurred. I believe there were larger counter-protests. Significantly, the colectivos did come out for this, so these are the pro-Maduro armed groups who are among the more radical supporters of the Maduro government. We discussed them in the Venezuela piece more extensively. They showed up, and there was shooting going on between opposition and Colectivo and security forces. But ultimately, the protests seem to have more or less dispersed. The opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez, appears to have gone now first to the Chilean embassy, and then I believe he was transferred to the Spanish embassy later on. So he seems to be trying to either gain protection or leave the country. I assume that's something else that will develop in the coming days. And so really, after these couple of days, Guaido is continuing to call for renewed protests. I think that the opposition basically is trying to strategically create momentum here to put pressure on the government, ultimately to fall, and for the U.S. and countries who recognize the opposition to increase their support. But in terms of on-the-ground support, it seems pretty clear that even within the cities where there may be more opposition support, the government still continues to be able to bring people out on the streets, and significantly institutions such as the military seem to still be standing by the government. So that's kind of the sum as to where events have led to for now.
Yeah, so one of the things I find most interesting is that he failed to follow the classic coup rulebook of you have to commandeer public broadcasting systems, TV, radio, communication systems, etc. And I believe the coup announcement or like attempted coup announcement or rebellion announcement or whatever you want to call it was just posted to Twitter.
Yeah, well, and in that way,
not everyone uses.
There may be a way in which you could say that this wasn't really a coup, because
if they didn't do all the stuff they need to.
Well, yeah, exactly. But even in terms of the goal, I mean, ultimately Guaido's goal is to take power. But I don't think that these protests were really meant to be that final moment. Presumably, had segments of the military defected, then this Operation Freedom idea would have entered a new phase where they try to take control.
I can accept that. That's the extremely bespoke take. It's not that it's not a coup because he's actually the legitimate leader or president of Venezuela. It's not a coup because it sucked so bad. I can accept that. I can accept that.
Something else that I could bring up here. So this is a story that's kind of been occurring alongside these protests. So Venezuela had been a member of the Organization of American States, which is sort of a coalition of states in North and South America, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And they generally try and deal with any number of Pan-American issues. Now in Venezuela, this is viewed as what they would call an imperialist organization because of the fact that it's headquartered in Washington, D.C., but also because with the way that these battles have been playing out, that organization has or members of that organization have, I believe, tried to get Venezuela removed, and Venezuela itself ultimately sought to leave the OAS. Now, Guaido has independently reached out to them and asked for Venezuela to remain a member. I believe he's appointed his own representatives. And so as these protests were happening, some of those processes had been finalized, and I think Venezuela has now left the OAS, but Guaido's representatives are still in contact with them, and this is kind of another small battleground now for recognition. And sort of as these protests were happening, there were one of the bylines of Maduro supporters on the streets was celebrating that Venezuela was no longer part of this organization. And this, you know, the Americas are interesting in that, in terms of countries that have recognized Guaido, which is a minority of countries worldwide, but a lot of them are actually in the Americas. So the US and Canada, of course, but then a number of countries in South America as well. So here you can kind of see this encirclement. I think that the Venezuelan government is probably seeing that this is the situation the Venezuelan government is seeing itself in.
And it may fall at some point in the future, just not at the current moment, I think. And I publicly, so you know, we sent some people down to Colombia and Venezuela for a Palladium article just over a month ago, and based on our analysis in that article, we concluded that U.S. military support in the form of of toppling the regime and prosecuting some kind of extended counterinsurgency campaign would be an absolute disaster. It would be an absolute disaster because of the irregular pro-Maduro forces, the fact that there are only so many ways to invade Venezuela feasibly, the fact that much of Venezuela is covered by deep jungle, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, not to mention foreign support as well from Russia and China and other countries. And so as a result of that, you know, I predicted as soon as I heard of the coup, basically, that it would immediately fail. And it seems as though that's come about. Maybe things drastically switch in the next 24 or 48 hours, but I'm still happy to hang myself on that prediction one way or another. And I think it unfortunately indicates the severe state of CIA capabilities in 2019. Just the absolute diminishment of our ability to do operations abroad. I mean, I know during the covert ops heyday, back during the Cold War, the CIA had some notable blunders, you know, especially with coups and assassinations and so on. But this is just a whole new level of kind of pathetic, limp-wristed, half-hearted attempt to make this. And it's made much worse by all of the posturing from administration officials and U.S. politicians like Marco Rubio on Twitter. Just as the bold talk escalates on Twitter, the actual capacity to carry out a coup operation goes exactly in the opposite direction. It's kind of an inverse relationship there. And it's pretty embarrassing. I don't know why they chose this very moment to try the coup, but it might be because Maduro forces were closing in, and this was the only time that they had, or the U.S. was getting impatient, so they said pull the trigger and we'll have your back. I think I don't know the exact dynamics of the relationship between the opposition and the U.S. Like I'm sure there was some probably fibbing about figures from the opposition to the U.S. To garner U.S. support in the first place, and then I'm sure there was some fibbing going the other way around with the extent of support that would be given to the opposition as a part of this operation. And so the consequence is that you have this nice CIA man saying, things will work out. Just trust me, just go ahead with this. Now's the time to pull the trigger. And then they pull the trigger, and it's a complete and utter disaster and a huge embarrassment. And you see all these, as I said, loud and obnoxious tweets from U.S. politicians on Twitter, and then it's just so pathetic to see the actual reality in play. I could respect it a little bit more if they were Godfather memeing on Twitter, and then they actually successfully toppled the regime really quickly, but it doesn't appear to be going that way at all, and so it's just a complete and utter embarrassment.
Well, I think one of the problems for the opposition here is in terms of the messaging that's come out from the United States itself and from the Trump administration, right? The predominant narrative that is shared by media organizations that are normally opposed to whatever the Trump administration does, like CNN or MSNBC, is that, it's this very familiar line that, well, we're just trying to help Venezuela restore democracy and restore human rights and all of this stuff. But then you have this confounding factor of John Bolton just straight up coming out and being like, man, it'd sure be great if American companies could get some of that sweet Venezuelan oil. And Bolton, he's always been a more, I guess, realistic on the fact that American foreign policy is an extension of, what's at least perceived as American interests. And this is creating problems on the ground, I'm sure, for the opposition, because there's something that we should think about, which is that when we're talking about who supports the government, there's a difference between who votes for PSUV, which is the governing party in an election, versus who would fight for the government, or at least not fight for an invading force if it was perceived to be like a foreign-backed coup where the sovereignty of Venezuela was at stake. Those are two different things. Within Venezuela, there are, I'm sure, plenty of people who aren't fans of the government. But, imagine look at any of the wars America fights. There's plenty of people who aren't voting for the governing party. But when a war is seen as against an enemy that you have essentially a patriotic duty to unify against, those differences are overcome. And so in a lot of cases, you can even see this.
Is that true, or is it like in Iraq? The vast majority of people, from what I understand, are just sort of ambivalent about the U.S. Maybe I could be completely wrong here, but then you get a few.
No, I think that's correct. A lot of people who opposed Saddam.
Oh, people who oppose Saddam don't necessarily support.
A war can be a unifying force, right? So we can look at Assad in Syria more recently, where you have, for example, the SSNP, which is the sort of nationalist party in Syria, which historically opposed Assad and the Ba'ath Arab party. But within the context of the civil war, they became one of the main forces on the ground allied with the Assad government.
Right, okay.
They were given actually responsibility in coordinating things like checkpoints and security work. And a number of these groups that had opposed the government are now quite unified with it. And, in the piece on the Middle Eastern Christians we discussed last time, we were talking about Lebanon and how where there had been, civil unrest and conflict a few decades ago, people on opposite sides of that war are now essentially unified in the new geopolitical situation. And the same presumably would happen in Venezuela to groups that are opposed to the Maduro government but don't necessarily want to see either a U.S.-backed government or just a return to the neoliberal regime that existed in the 90s.
So let's bring up the brief question of whether we could call what is happening or what has happened in Venezuela a coup. Because some people have made the argument that, there's, based on some sort of constitutional clause, there's some obscure semi-legal argument that could be made to the effect that the opposition is in fact Guaido is in fact the lawful and just president of Venezuela, something like this. And so, in fact, what this is just a restoration of the existing authority and a removal of an illegitimate authority, and therefore it's some sort of like transition.
Existing authority. I mean, the guy was never in there in the first place, right? Like maybe I don't know what the specific sort of claim is legally. Like maybe he got the vote or whatever. But like there's an existing regime.
Yes.
They're trying to depose it by force or by at least by extra legal means.
My problem here is that doing weird legal magic about legitimacy and distorting that frame as though Maduro himself has no claim to legitimacy and it's purely just Guaido, like he's the sole arbiter of legitimacy, and it's so very clear cut. Well, it's not clear cut at all. In fact, I'm not saying you couldn't make an argument in his direction. But it's
not about legitimacy at all. It's just
far
like
from clear.
Whether it's a coup is not about legitimacy at all. It's like there is an existing regime. It is in charge. Someone else is trying to overthrow that regime by various means outside of the system. That attempt to overthrow the thing is being put down and is not succeeding. Like
there are different ways you could define
mechanically what's going on here is a coup. We have a word for this.
So there are some people that want to integrate the concept of legitimacy into the concept of coup, right? Such that whether it's a coup or not but the problem is when you're trying to do social science, proper social science, and
if you're trying to actually understand the world instead of engage in like deceptive propaganda, then you use terms that are clear and technical.
You use clear
nonsense.
and technical terms that are that sort of you strip of as much perspectival properties as possible, and legitimacy is legitimacy is one of these voodoo properties that essentially allows you to go around toppling any regime you want by coming
fire up the legitimacy printing machine in the basement in Washington.
Exactly, the legitimacy printing machine, just like that. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and so one of the confounding factors when it comes to legitimacy is that there have been changes to the Venezuelan constitution that have occurred under the Chavez and Maduro governments, and part of that was the creation of new electoral bodies. Now, the opposition currently, I believe, controls the National Assembly, which is where they're trying to create this argument that as leaders of the National Assembly, they have the ability to depose the president. However, there are other bodies which were created, it seems, so that the government could have institutions within the state that it viewed as more dependable. There was a whole arc of conflict where the courts, the Supreme Court in Venezuela, for a time delegitimized the National Assembly itself. I believe that's now been revoked and it has legitimacy again. But the opposition, because all of these changes required, or a lot of them required, either elections or sort of ratifying referenda, which the opposition then they refused to participate in those referenda, in those elections. And so this sort of confounds the case for legitimacy, and it can be used either way, because people who support the government can say, well, you refused to participate in an election, but the election still happened, and constitutionally speaking, then the government's position is clear. The opposition line has generally been that they consider the elections to be corrupted, and that their refusal to participate was a legitimate form of protest because the elections were not legitimate to begin with.
Well, that actually just goes back to support the "it's a coup" line, because like at the point where the official legitimate mechanisms have broken down and no one trusts the official legitimate mechanisms, if you're trying to take over the government and you claim that the official mechanisms are not legitimate, then you're trying to take over the government from outside of the official legitimate mechanisms, and therefore it is a coup. So
so when there's fighting, when the security forces are shooting at each other in the streets, at that point, this is not going to be resolved by arguing
this isn't an argument
your case within the constitutional mechanisms.
And it's funny that both Bloomberg and the Washington Post ran stories or op-eds rather saying, don't call this a coup. It's the expression of like free and fair and legitimate protest or something like this. Not quite, but that's basically the gist of it. The Bloomberg one was done by Eli Lake in particular, who's kind of notorious for jumping on the bandwagon of any like harebrained regime change scheme that has ever existed and will ever exist. And if you read Eli Lake's piece, you'll see how utterly incoherent it is. I pointed some of this out on Twitter. He's like,
someone's like, "Hey Eli, write this thing or you lose your job."
No,
like,
it's not quite that at all.
I mean, it doesn't really work like that.
No. I think he legitimately, like, he probably believes this or whatever, but that doesn't mean it's not stupid, because that's a whole different topic. But the piece itself, I highly recommend that people read it to see the shoddy level of discourse and the semantic games played there. But it's not even sophisticated. It's really just really, really bad. Like, just really bad. But it's not smart. There's no, oh, this is, I could see a plausible case here, or this is semi-convincing, or like, maybe it's a toss-up, 50-50 here. It's like, no, it's just, the whole article was actually just really, really bad. Like, it was just terrible.
Well, what this sort of starts to remind me of is like, there's this thing where they sort of come out in a semi-coordinated way, the kind of like establishment voices, they come out in a semi-coordinated way, like with some line that's kind of really half-baked, like, oh yeah, don't call it a coup, or like, it reminds me of the Easter worshippers thing that happened a little while back when those people Christians got bombed at Easter. And like, big American officials, like Easter worshippers, they don't want to call it Christian, but it's like very obvious they've coordinated on the use of their language, right? And then like further back, kind of the fake news thing, which just came out of nowhere. All these mainstream publications talking about fake news, kind of all on the same day. Like, there's obviously some coordination behind the scenes, but it's like, it's becoming like more and more incoherent and like transparently coordinated in a way. Well, like, you can imagine like a sophisticated propaganda operation, but by these forces that don't really want to reveal themselves.
Now that you have communication systems that are really efficient, all it takes is like, an email from the DNC or the RNC or this and that, and people.
It's like, all right, here's our line.
Yeah.
But it's just like it's becoming really obvious and transparent and like half baked.
Yeah.
Like a sophisticated propaganda organization or a sophisticated propaganda machine would like not look so clumsy in making these public stances.
Yeah. So
I think that
go ahead, Ash.
I'm thinking, in terms of the long run for Venezuela here, because Jonah, you sort of mentioned you had publicly predicted that this coup was not going to be successful, and I think moving, looking even a bit longer term than that, we sort of discussed this when we were discussing the Venezuela piece originally, but one of the things that will contribute to the outcome of the situation is the popular support that the sides actually feel they have. And I think something that I've seen consistently underestimated, in the media, but I think also just as I've talked with people who follow this, who are generally informed and smart people, is an underestimation of how much support the memory of Chavez, if not Maduro himself, then the memory of Chavez has among the Venezuelan people. Because, when generally a lot of people who we meet in the Venezuelan diaspora, say, are going to be people aligned with the opposition, because they are usually people of the particular class that tends to support the opposition. And that can skew one's view, right? Because if most of the Venezuelans one meets, say, in DC or New York or in Toronto or in San Francisco are supporting the opposition, then the impression you get is, well, like, oh, clearly, like, the whole country is behind the opposition and this is dictatorial. But one has to remember that is not necessarily representative of the country itself. And when the government first came in, the level of poverty in a lot of areas was quite high, and the fact, for a lot of especially poor and working class Venezuelans, they remember the cult of Chavez, and they remember programs that were rolled out where they got a level of education and economic assistance and so on, and they also they embraced this discourse of anti-imperialism and fighting the Yankee Empire and all of this stuff. And regardless of, one can have all sorts of arguments about the factual basis and who's right and who's wrong, but just in the pure sense of people feeling a gut loyalty to the memory of that, even if they dislike the successor, that's quite strong. And there are segments of Venezuela which will remain loyal to Chavez until the day they die. And, groups like the Colectivos are just the most maybe militant and fanatical manifestation of that. And so in either case here, because if one takes the view that the fact that Maduro has been able to come to no kind of agreement with this significant part of the population that does support the opposition, if one takes that as some kind of delegitimizing factor, well, an opposition taking power, and especially if it's backed by the United States and by foreign governments, that situation will be far more exacerbated, I would predict, with the segments of Venezuela that remain loyal to the memory of Chavez. And so that argument cuts both ways very easily. So trying to create some kind of unity government, I don't really know how that will actually end up working out within the Venezuelan context.
I want to point out, going back to one thing I said before when talking about the legitimacy printing machine in some DC basement. There's just no country on earth where you can't manufacture a case that the existing government is illegitimate, and therefore toppling that regime wouldn't be a coup, but rather a transition or a restoration of actually legitimate authority. And that's really the problem with conceiving of a coup as necessarily having a component of legitimacy in order for that concept to
what
exist in the
what
first
this comes
place.
down to is, I want to kind of plug the entire project of Palladium here a bit. What this comes down to is a moralization of technical language. We have these terms that we use to describe what's actually happening and to actually understand the world, not necessarily through a moral lens, but just what's going on here. And those are terms like coup and so on. And then you see this repeatedly in American discourse where these technical terms and just calling something like it actually is and calling it just a particular technical frame becomes moralized, and people have because there's these implicit and often explicit conflations of particular structural things as being inherently this way or that, morally and legitimately. And so it means we have to lie and say that a bunch of things are democratic that aren't actually democratic from a technical point of view, because democracy is seen as synonymous with this legitimacy thing. And there's many more examples. This coup thing is one of them, right? It's oh, well, we don't like coups. Coups are not a democratic mechanism, therefore they must be bad. Therefore, if we support
regime change,
if we support a coup, then it must not be a coup. And it's it just completely confuses your entire way of thinking about the world. It completely confuses your ontology. And so I was doing a lot of trying to explain Palladium this last weekend. I was at the YC 120 conference put on by Y Combinator, trying to explain the project. And it's one of the things that we're trying to do is create a little pocket of discourse here where we're not moralizing everything and we're not distorting all our technical understanding and subordinating our technical understanding to some political ideology or even expedience, which kind of looks like the case in this Venezuela thing. We have this big problem, which is that if we're doing that all the time, if we're moralizing everything and all our discourse is on that level, then we actually end up with nobody who understands how the stuff actually works. And we really need people who understand how this stuff actually works, which means using technical terms in their truthful connotation rather than their moral connotation.
No, I actually...
So this is like what I think is a really big part of the project at Palladium, is like kind of what we mean by governance futurism, or part of what we mean by governance futurism is like, let's just look at the thing straight. Let's like boldly look into the future and not try to moralize it immediately, but instead build up our system of knowledge first.
I think there's possibly a tension between the desire to formalize existing power relations and to refer to things by their proper technical terms, and the need for states to kind of act surreptitiously at times, and to I mean, why wouldn't we expect them? But that's just the thing, especially if they don't have the full power to do what they would like to do, because such actions in favor of their interests would cause them to lose some amount of legitimacy. Why, in that case, why wouldn't we expect them to want to apply the same sort of stifling corporate PR language to foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, like, of course we expect it. I think that's I think we have to make that clear. It's not like the establishment could, in the current structural position, really do anything different, because, like, for whatever reason, they kind of need to convince the American people, whatever that is, that what's going on in Venezuela, is like, this side is right, that side is wrong. Like, for some reason, there's these like there's some public that you have to dupe about what you're doing. And like, so I think
this is probably true in any state.
Yeah, it's true in any state. It's gonna, but like what the structural constraints on the public story are gonna change depending on the structure of the state and who you need kind of on board, and whether people you need on board need to be duped. And like, there's an important difference between like operational secrecy, like, oh yeah, we're carrying out this thing, think of it what you will, we don't care, it's going to get carried out, versus like somehow needing public legitimacy for something where it's like, oh, it's not a coup, it's
and then there's
like,
just mass epistemic poisoning at that point.
and like, even if you're going to need that mass epistemic poisoning, which, like, I'm not partial to that kind of governance, but even if you need that, somewhere there needs to be a pocket of discourse where people are actually using the right technical terms, and I no longer have confidence that exists in the American discourse.
Well, that's the problem with the obfuscation of language, is that because this is in propaganda, this sort of is something that strategically makes sense to do, because obviously if the foundation of your legitimacy is democracy, then you want to be the Democrats and your enemies are anti-democratic. But we see that this is actually leaked over into the theory that people who are aspiring to join the governing class are imbibed in elite universities. And so when that talking point came out about it's not a coup because they're trying to restore democracy, this reminded me a bit of liberal democratic peace theory, right? Which, Jonah, you wrote a piece on some time back for Palladium, and the one of the points that I remember you discussing was that in practice, the way we define liberal democracy crosses over with which countries are members of the American alliance. And so you kind of mix up the cause and the effect there. Now, if you're someone who's trying to legitimize America as a country or a world order, then it makes sense to say something like, well, we're the ones guaranteeing democracy. But when you're trying to figure out why the liberal order works, or why the American alliance is able to function and go along, then just using these simplistic obfuscations is actually going to make you misunderstand your own basis of power. And the coup thing is just one particular manifestation of how that seems to be embraced. And in this way, right, someone like Bolton, who is viewed as this hardliner and a fanatic, I would say he actually just understands and is willing to say, maybe that's the major difference. Here's our motivation. Here's why he sees this action of overthrowing the Maduro government is beneficial to the United States. But this is a sort of realpolitik that is unacceptable to the polite, the polite niceties, let's say, of people who've gone to Ivy League universities and have imbibed this obfuscated language, which lets you feel more morally clean about what you're doing, maybe, but actually ends up causing harm in the long run, because then you start these kinds of interventions that don't end up working, and you actually create a tremendous amount of suffering.
Yeah, I mean, like we're ultimately idealists, right? Like, we want the world to work better. We want to be part of like a moral society and so on. But I think it's really critical to understand that you actually can't do that unless you're being honest with yourself about what you're doing. Like, if you're not being honest with yourself about how the thing works and what you're actually doing, then you're just not going to look at the parts of what you're doing that are actually not good. And you're not going to be able to make them better. You're not going to be able to make your thing run more efficiently or more morally. It's just going to like squish some people, and you're going to say, oh yeah, but they deserved it, right? Because your thing is like axiomatically moral. And so I think it's like, it's, say what you will about like Bolton's open imperialism, like at least it's honest, right? Like, I think honesty is one of the big virtues in this space. We first, before trying to like pretend that we're being all good and everything, like, let's be honest about what we're doing, and be honest about how these things work. And then we can actually look at the world through a lens of wisdom, and we can look at then and sort of, then embark on the project of actually making it better. And I think like sort of an additional point I'll just throw in here is like, we're talking a lot about like propaganda in this area, and I think like an important question is just like, why do you need the propaganda? Where is the need for propaganda coming from? I mean, I'm not endeavoring to really answer that here, but like, I think it's a good question to ask, is like, why do we need to lie about this? What structural factors are leading to our need to lie?
And I don't expect by calling out the joke, as it were, that but that by doing this we're going to cause some sort of major impact on broader U.S. discourse.
No, I mean, that's not the point.
The sheep wake up, sheeple,
no.
Wake up.
No, I mean,
wake up, sheeple.
Yeah,
it's not going to happen, right?
To be clear, what Palladium is about here is not like, oh yeah, we're trying to like call out the discourse and like change things or whatever.
It's all lies, Illuminati.
Whatever, Jonah. what we're trying to do is create a pocket of discourse where it is possible to be honest, and because like the overall discourse, like for a lot of reasons, as we've said, like structurally is like incapable of kind of like analyzing things clearly, but it needs that clear analysis needs to exist somewhere, or else we're totally screwed.
Well, and this is something I commented about. I think I mentioned on Twitter as well that there's this weird trait I would say in the liberal order in general, but I think especially in political media culture, where it's based on this weird pragmatism of ends and idealism of means. Right. And what I mean by that is that in terms of the ends of the liberal order, on a very, so Bolton, we want their oil, it's a very pragmatic end. But even in terms of the more philosophical idea, and one could have endless debates about this, but of liberalism, the idea is that you do not have some kind of overarching unifying good. Rather, every individual determines their own idea of the good and what's worth pursuing. And so there in a way shouldn't be any higher unifying cause. Rather, you're just maintaining the ability of each person to pursue their own end, because anything else is inadvisable. But then with this pragmatism of ends is this idealism of means, where we embark on these nation-building projects. We allow these coups to happen. We destabilize entire regions of the world, because the way that you get to that end has to be within a sort of Western capitalist, liberal, democratic set of institutions, and so these institutions are paramount to preserve this pragmatism. I think in a way, what makes us distinct, certainly myself, I prefer an idealism of ends and a pragmatism of means.
Right. I think that's a good way to put it. Like, and what we've just been talking about, the moralization of language about what's actually happening and how these things work really comes down to that idealism of means. Like, if a coup is always bad, then if you support it for pragmatic reasons, like we want the oil, then it must not be a coup. Right? Which is like completely incoherent logic. But like that's kind of what you're forced into if you take that stance of idealism of means is you're actually forced directly into perversion of language.
So, and on that note, we've got about 15 minutes left. I think it's time for us to explore one of the recent pieces that was published in Palladium about the Balkans. The title of the piece is "The Balkans Are Hanging by an American Thread." The author is Luka Jukic. And so basically, let me just intro it for a second. Basically, the piece is looking at the Dayton Agreement that was signed on December 14th, 1995. And it's a bit of a look back over that past time on how it's functioned and the crucial role America has played in keeping that region of the world stable, and the potential now for that region to completely devolve into chaos.
Well,
again.
like to make it clear, it's like, okay, the U.S.'s role in keeping that region stable. Basically, like the U.S. sort of stepped in and helped stop the ethnic war that was happening in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then like the ceasefire basically took the form of the states of Bosnia and Kosovo, where things are still substantially mixed, but and still very high tensions and almost failed states in some cases. We analyze this in the piece, internal to Bosnia, some interesting things going on.
And so we were just talking about Bolton, and Bolton says now they've got to solve it for themselves. The problems.
In other words, America pulls out, and now this big powder keg is left without any sort of fire suppressant.
And so this is the piece is basically a look at what could happen given full American pullout, which of course has not happened yet and may not happen. As usual, when Trump administration officials are making public statements, sometimes it's just the opening of a negotiation, so it's never really clear if that's just an attempt to get concessions or if that's the entire policy that they tend to go through with. I tend to think in this case, they actually do want to withdraw. They don't see the Balkans, they don't have a whole lot of strategic interest in the Balkans.
Yeah, well, I think Luka makes the point that Kosovo actually is kind of a mess, and that the proposed solution sort of makes sense with respect to Kosovo itself, and that the U.S. for various reasons does have an interest in pulling out of the region. But he kind of goes and analyzes the knock-on effects of that in the form of this, if they were to divide Kosovo along ethnic lines, which is I think one of the proposals on the table, this actually reopens the debate about where the ethnic borders should be, and then that really inflames things in Bosnia, where there's a Serbian sort of breakaway republic that it hasn't quite gotten to the point of wanting to claim to break away, but it's it has the ability to do that, and that could end up being kind of pretty messy.
What I find interesting about the Dayton Agreement itself is that at least back then, I think they weren't as rosy-eyed about the view of moving in, sending in some troops, and establishing a democracy, calling it a day, and exiting it. That sort of delusion didn't really surface until much later in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah.
At this point, they were still willing to set up basically colonial arrangements, and so the Dayton Agreement led to the creation of the Office of the High Representative. And essentially, it's a very illiberal governing structure that even some people have referred to as a modern-day British Raj. For example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, international administrators have totally defined the agenda, forced the agenda on the country's institutions, and then punished any actors who aren't interested in cooperating. The OHR only answers to an unelected body of various foreign ministries, and more or less has unlimited legal powers when it comes to handling the country, for example. And so it has massive amounts of unchecked power, and when it feels like things are getting out of hand, it'll say like, hand legislators a bunch of legislation it's drafted and say, pass this or else, more or less. And so it's not quite colonialism in the sense that there's no major element of resource extraction, but it is some sort of like illiberal protectorate, which is.
But then it's a really weird illiberal protectorate because it doesn't actually seem to have managed to institutionalize itself in the sense that it comes in with all these competing power centers and then slowly, either cannibalizes or dissolves their areas of influence. Because as we see, as we've already mentioned, we have this sort of Serb Republic, we have Croatian regions in the country in Bosnia that don't particularly feel represented. We have a multi-ethnic region. And we have foreign states, such as Croatia, which appear to be actively present through political parties.
The only claim I'm making here is that the arrangement is shockingly illiberal compared to U.S. rhetoric about what it takes for a government to be legitimate.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. But I think one can also see within the context here of American interventionism trying to create institutions, and in this case, more explicitly with the United Nations being involved, there seems to be essentially a succession problem occurring where on the one hand, there is this question of the ideology and the on-the-ground institutions. But then those institutions sort of, maybe they've managed to create a locus where these different parties can find temporary agreements with each other. But definitely with the analysis being presented here, it seems to be that each segment of the region is consolidating itself in a way that will ultimately divide Bosnia as an entity. And so this, I think, is something worth pointing out, because in any international order, right, and in any empire, we've discussed this idea of the American empire before, they survive because they're able to provide succession and continuity. And that's how you have institutions that last generations, that last centuries. And with the American empire, something that's happened in the last 25 years is a sort of frenetic moving to different centers of activity in the world, where here, right, they started in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Then they moved to the Middle East, and now there's a shift towards China and the East Asia region. And I've seen this, I've definitely seen this specifically represented as a shift away from the Middle East into the Asia region. So in each case here, we're getting these sort of patchwork institutions being created that aren't actually able to provide succession or continuity.
Yeah, so what I found interesting about this piece is that so actually going back to my previous point for a second, in response to what you were saying about the OHR and its structure, since 2005 it has started to back down a lot from some of the major impositions that it's handed down in the past. I haven't done a recent, as of last month, analysis on the current status of OHR. So it's possible, if I looked closely at it, that the escalation in tensions recently could be a product of OHR backing down over the last 10, 15 years or so. Not sure about that.
Can you explain what OHR is?
The Office of the High Representative.
Is that the Bosnian thing?
That's a product of the Dayton Agreement.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, so technically, the agreement itself, I think, created the peace implementation Council, the PIC, which then gradually expanded to be the OHR. So that's just some background knowledge of, the Balkans in the 90s. But another interesting piece of info here is the extent to which that we haven't covered so far is not a class of civilizations by any means, but the various ethnic and religious groups appealing to various foreign powers that would be aligned with them. So Turkey and the Bosniaks, Serbs and Russians, but the problem is that even if the Russians and Serbians have some kind of link, there's not a huge strategic reason for Russia to involve itself in the Balkans to come up with a major solution to the problem, and that's really kind of the heart of the problem here, is that there's no major incentive for everyone to get involved again in a very messy conflict that is hurtling toward this conflict. So,
well, and if it did become a conflict, I think, like, the clash of civilizations point that Luka makes is pretty interesting. That the Croats tend to be Western aligned, the Serbs tend to be Russian aligned,
yeah,
and the Muslims tend to be Turkey and broader Muslim aligned, and so if you did get any kind of conflict, like an ethnic conflict there, obviously that would very quickly become like a more broadly politicized conflict between Islam and Western aligned sort of Western nationalists and potentially Russian. I'm not sure what factions would come from there, but you could imagine a lot of irregular factions. Like, it doesn't even have to be the states themselves. It can be the irregular factions aligned with those sort of broad kind of civilizational themes going in. Like, if there was a conflict between like Croats and Bosnian Muslims or something, you'd imagine like a lot of Western nationalists kind of pouring in, as they did in Ukraine, and likewise sort of foreign fighters on the Muslim side, as they did in Syria, and so that's like it's this interesting like larger ripple effect, where if there was any kind of dust up there, even if the big power players themselves don't necessarily have an interest in it, there's a lot of irregular forces that might.
Well, and this shows you the importance, I think, of geopolitics, because if one looks at the history of the region, being this area, this bridge region between Europe and between the Near East and Eurasia, the conflicts there have gone on for literally centuries, and even in the period of where you had the Byzantine Empire in the east, and you had a sort of growing Roman Catholic missionary effort in the West. It's that history that contributes to the fact that you have Catholic and Eastern Orthodox communities living right near each other, and there was even conflict in those days. It shows you as well why Yugoslavia, when it existed, actually it was able to punch above its geopolitical weight, because lying in that region, it was able to balance the Soviet Union to its east and the European NATO bloc to its west against each other, and thereby survive. But this is only possible when someone is able to actually unify the region in a single political entity. And I mean that was really only Tito, in the context of World War II, was able to make that happen.
Going back to what Wolf was talking about the different ethnic groups and so on. In Bosnia, as the article notes, the country provided the second most foreign fighters per capita of
After
any European
Belgium.
country to terrorist organizations in Syria. And of course, the award in Europe for number one is, of course, Belgium, unsurprising to anyone, because of Molenbeek. But we'll have to spend another episode going into that further. And during the Bosnian War, Bosnia hosted thousands of foreign fighters from across the Muslim world. That was known as the Bosnian Mujahideen, and so you can only imagine as conflict accelerates that perhaps it would that figure would increase just so much more dramatically this time, and that any radical strains of Islam present in Bosnia would be much more magnified. Ash, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I with Turkey, I think there's an interesting thing happening because as you mentioned, the Islamic or Islamist ideology is clearly playing a role here. But with Turkey trying to exercise power in the region, there's even an ethnic side of this. So I think I've mentioned this on a previous episode, but Erdogan made a speech in the last couple of years where he was discussing the Ottoman Empire and about how they regretted, having left Sofia, I think was the city he mentioned, which of course is a European city. And he got, there was outrage initially when he made the speech, but as we can see, those ties, both Muslim and Turkic ties, because of course Turkic Islam is a very distinctive form of Sunni Islam in and of itself, and people who may not have been as amenable to, say, Wahhabi-influenced Islamist ideology might be more open to a sort of more neo-Ottoman version of this. You can even see the ethnic element coming up in places you wouldn't expect. So Hungary, for example, which has a Magyar heritage, despite the fact that it's a Catholic country, a Christian country, it has also historically had a certain expression of this pan-Turkic ideology. And that idea certainly exists in Hungarian society, despite this religious difference and despite the very strongly Christian politics that are currently in power there. And so, we talked last episode about religious literacy, but this is even a larger scale. You have to have a literacy in a situation like this of how very complex interminglings of ethnicity and religion and history all work. And as I think we've said repeatedly, it does not seem to be the case that the Western and the American governing class are really able to play this game well. And Russia, despite the fact that its geopolitical power may be lesser than that of the United States, seems to at least have a certain consciousness due to its own history about how this works that allows it to keep resurfacing and drawing on these ties, in this case in the Balkans, but as we discussed, even in the Middle East now. And so unless we become more literate and more familiar in how this kind of politics works, I think that succession problem that we mentioned is basically going to remain unresolved.
Well, and with that, that's about all the time we have for this week. This has been the Palladium Podcast, episode 7, and we'll see everyone next time.
See you guys.